you will, go on ahead, open your Bibles to the 126th Psalm. Part of this psalm is familiar to many people. It is a group of psalms known as the Psalms of Ascent. These were the songs that people would sing. It starts with Psalm 120, and it goes down through Psalm 135, 134, and it's 15 psalms. And these psalms are called Psalms of Ascent because they go back to when people would go to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was built on a hill. If you can see right there, that's Jerusalem. On the backside of Jerusalem, where the mountain kind of went up a little bit on the eastern side, it kind of fell down a sharp kind of cliff as it went down into the valley that was originally the Jordan and the Dead Sea. So there really wasn't a good way to get up to it from the east side, and if you came in from the west, you had to go up through valleys and mountains, and so you always had to go up. And then on top of that, then they built up part of Jerusalem when they built Solomon's temple so that it would be higher than everything else on the high point. And so this Song of Ascents was because as people would go up, they would sing these songs as they were going up to the temple. Now, why do we look at this song? Well, 3 times a year. And I want you to see something with this, because I think sometimes people think the gospel is more difficult than it is in many regards. Because back in Exodus 23, beginning at verse 14, he says this to the people. He says, 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you, at the time appointed in the month of Abib. For in it you came out of Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty. The feast of harvests, the feast of the harvest, the first fruits of your labors which you've sown in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you've gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. And he said, well, that's not too bad. Well, it wasn't too bad, right? Kind of. But now we get to the next one. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord God. Now he had told them originally, he said that when they came into the land, there would come a time where the Lord would put his name in a city, and that was where they would go. Now, because Florida doesn't have a lot of big hills, okay, there's a part where this would kind of be lost, but imagine if 3 times a year you had to walk from here to Jacksonville, and you had to take your lamb or your cow with you, and you say, hey brother, only the men have to go. The ladies get an exemption. That's right. You say, well, brother, that still wouldn't be fun because of swamps and 90 miles round trip each direction 3 times a year. That's not fun. Now imagine if you put a 1,000-foot incline and a 2,000-foot decline and a 3,000-foot incline, a 1,000-foot decline, and then another 2,000 feet up. And you got to do this coming and going 3 times in the year. Now, when I picked this song, I don't trust the weather guys, right? The weather guys say the weather will be bad this day. I don't always trust that, right? Because they're wrong as often as they're right, you know? I had figured we'd have more people because roads would be open and accessible today when I originally picked this. I know there's some people that's not true. But I want you to think about how easy it is for us to come to the Lord. In the psalm that Evan read, if we would have kept reading there, and in Malachi, the Lord talks about how he brings the mountains down, he raises the valleys up, he takes the rough places and he smooths them out, and he takes the crooked roads and he makes them straight. That the gospel overall is easy to come to. You don't have to go 3 times a year to appear before the Lord and take all this stuff. And so when they would go, they would sing songs. Now, what's the value of singing songs? And I know you know the value, Brother Gene. If you can get 60 guys singing the same song on the same meter, can those guys do just about anything with one song because their breathing and their heartbeat and their timing is all together? And so you say, yeah, that's, if you ever wonder why the military runs around singing those ridiculous songs, as you get used to the song, everybody's on the same breathing pattern, the same heartbeat pattern, everything goes on the same rhythm, and everybody, you can take anywhere between 30 and 100 people and move them as one mind, one everything with a simple song. And so the people would sing these songs as they went up. But all the songs reminded them where their help was, but it also reminded them that this world wasn't their home. And you and I have that same reminder. Over in the book of 1 Peter, chapter 1, verse 17, he says to us what? And if you call on the Father, who without partiality judges according to each one's work, conduct yourselves throughout the time of your sojourning here in fear, during the time of your pilgrimage. And then in chapter 2, he says, Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims. I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims. One of the great challenges we have is to look at this life as though we're just here temporarily. We make plans, and James reminds us, we make plans about what we're going to do next year or the year after that. And he tells us what? Make sure you say, if the Lord wills, because you don't know if you're going to be here tomorrow. You don't know certain things. So sometimes you do have to say, if the Lord wills. And so it's in a background of having to come to the Lord. It's in a background of their lives having been turned upside down. Because as the psalm opens, Psalm 126 in verse 1, it says, When the Lord brought back the captivity of Zion, we were like those who dream. I think everybody's had those dreams. Dreams where you wake up and after you orient, you're glad that what you had in the dream isn't your reality. And then other times that when you wake up from a dream and you orient yourself, you're wishing you could go back into your dream because it was better there. He says that's what it was like when the Lord brought us back to our homeland. They had been away during the Babylonian captivity, and most of the people who came back to the land had never seen what the land was before they were taken into captivity. But they were glad to be back home. They were glad to be back home. When we went up to Birmingham last month, I don't like driving in Georgia. I don't like driving in Alabama. I definitely don't like driving in Mississippi. You say, well, then you're lucky to be in Florida. Well, yeah, because it's not those other three states. I forget how long it takes to get out of Alabama. Depending on where you are, it feels like forever times 10. And my navigator did a great job. Her name was Catherine. She did a great job. And she's like, take this road to this place. And I know Florida is south, but everything on the dashboard compass and every road says north and northeast. And in my head, I'm trying to figure out, how is this ever going to get me back to Florida? Because who understands, from Alabama going northeast generally never gets you to Florida. And then finally, all of a sudden, the road changed, and all of a sudden it was going south and east. We won't even talk about the one road that actually had me going west for a while. Not really sure. But I was glad when we got back into Florida. And then I was glad when we turned off at Ellisville. And then I was really glad when I hit the Union County border. You say, no. Having lived in so many places in the United States, when I finally get adjusted to the next place the Lord moves me, I really hate to ever leave there. I really hate to ever leave there. Years ago when we were in Alabama, we went for vacation. Catherine's grandmother passed away. It was at Christmas time, basically this time of the year right now. And Shane and I, we looked at each other after the funeral and we said, let's go, let's get loaded up and let's get gone before everybody else gets back to the house and starts to eat a meal, or we'll never get out of Birmingham. And we rejoiced when we hit the Alabama line. Not because we were in Mississippi, but because we were finally out of Alabama. Then we rejoiced when we hit the Arkansas line.
No more kudzu.
No more kudzu. And we were so glad when we crossed over that hill back into Sharp County. You see, sometimes it's just good to be home. Sometimes it's just good to be home. I would put Ronnie in remembrance of his hospital stay in Cheyenne, Wyoming. You were glad to be gone from Wyoming, my brother, and I know that. But you see, that attachment that they have, that even though we've been redeemed out of the world, we haven't gone all the way home yet. So like those who dream, he says, the psalmist says, then was our mouth filled with laughter, and our tongue was singing. Then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. See, one of the hardest things about being a sojourner, about realizing that this life is just temporary, is to sing songs of gladness and to be filled with laughter. Because there's always a tension between the now and the then. In the now, everything isn't like it should be. And in the then, it is kind of like a dream. You believe it, you look forward to it, but exactly what it's going to be like, you don't know. And let's be honest, there are some days in the now. There are some days in the now that are miserable. And so being able to say the Lord has done great things for us, we are glad even in the miserable moments, requires us to change. When he says, verse 4, bring back our captivity, O Lord, as streams in the south, or some of your Bibles might say as streams in the Negev. If you've ever been out, and for me it's Arizona more than any place else. When Arizona gets a nice rain and that water runs through the valleys, through those arroyos and everything else, what was a barren wasteland comes alive with color. What looked like nothing becomes this most beautiful landscape, and it's only for a season. And for them it was only a season too. But their prayer is, just like when the wet season comes after the drought, make that the way life is for us all the time. Bring us back from that. Because in verse 5 and in verse 6, he gives us something that if we'll take, can bless us. He says, those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. Now look at the pattern there. Those who sow in tears. You can't sow in anger. You can't sow in frustration. But you can sow in sorrow. You say, why are you telling me this? The only thing you get when you sow in anger is more anger. But when you sow in sorrow, in the brokenness of heart, of what could have been, what should have been, what might have been, that has caused you this distress, it's the seed of the hope that you've sown, that you've watered with your own tears. Because the thing that you hope for is the thing that should bring joy. And so when you sow that hope and water it with those tears, now there can be something different come out of it. But the key is the question of how long. You can grow lettuce quick. You can sow lettuce and harvest lettuce fairly quick. You can't do the same with pecans or pecans, whichever way you like it. Won't work. In 10 years in Texas, well, 9 years, I just rounded up to 10, right? 9 years in Texas, someone had planted a pecan tree. Because it was in Texas, it was a pecan tree. If it had been here, it had been a pecan tree. All right? They had planted it years before we ever got there. I know the tree was at least 15 years old. It had never put a pecan on yet. Never had. But on the church property, there were 2 pecan trees. And they weren't the big ones. They were the little ones. They were the native ones. And one of them had more flavor than 100 of the big ones. And we know they were at least 130 years old. We estimate from some of the other stuff they were a minimum of 150 actually. And every year, drought, no drought, didn't matter. They would dump so much. And homeless people and poor people would come by the church with paper sacks. And they'd say, "Can we get in on your playground to pick up the pecans to go sell them so that we have cash for food?" And I'd tell them, "Sure. I mean, what did I care? You know, I'd go out and get my bag. You know, there's still 50 more bags out there." He said, "What does that have to do with reaping and sowing?" The bigger the heartache, the longer it may take for you to reap your harvest in joy. But there's a place for it. Small tears are easily healed from. Deep tears take a little bit of time. And this is why he says to us what he says in verse 6. He who continually goes forth weeping, bearing seed for sowing, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves. We sing that song. We don't sing it much anymore, but we used to sing it. Bringing in the sheaves. Bringing in the sheaves. There we go. You have to sow something. As this year closes out, on the downside of it, in some ways, this year has been worse than 2020. In some ways, this year has been second worst to 2020. And in other areas, it's been a fantastic year. I'm going to say to you, don't fail to sow the seed that caused you sorrow, that you wept over. Don't let the year close out without sowing that and entrusting it to the Lord. Because my heart's desire for you. And if you're looking deep, there's things that you know that have caused you heartache and pain this past year. Things that are remnants from the captivity that we all share in this world. Sow it. Don't waste it. And then keep your eye open. Keep your eye open. And look for the rejoicing. So that when you see that your harvest is there, grab it. Take it. Don't leave it in the field. On the road going past the prison, as you get on the other side of the river and you're going up the hill and you round into that big curve. This is the first year that I've seen that old boy had let his corn go to seed corn. Every other year, when it's been ready to harvest, he's harvested. This was the first year, and it struck me because it was the first pasture that I saw that had gone to seed corn since I've been here. And seed corn always confused me as a kid. Because when we came in, it was nonstop till every last wheat field was harvested. And then they went further north. And they didn't stop till they got to Canada. But it always baffled me as a kid. What made one field different from another field? And I know, it wasn't just the signs that said DeKalb, 1041 or DeKalb 973 or whatever, for whichever hybrid it was. But I knew one thing, because I knew guys that messed it up. There's a time to harvest sweet corn, there's a time to harvest seed corn. And if you miss the time, all you get is blight, and you ruin your whole harvest. I want to say to you, when you sow your seed of sorrow with the hope in it, keep your eye open for the harvest of joy. And when it comes in, be ready to recognize it, be ready to grab it, and when you do, let forth your shout of praise and thanksgiving. Because in that is the law of the harvest. One seed of corn can produce one stalk of corn that has how many other years and seeds on it. It can outstrip it by 300, 500 fold easy. And so God can do the same with you. He can do the same with me. But we have to sow it and trust it to Him, and we have to be ready to reap it when the time comes. And as a proof of that He gave us, I take you back to the cross. How many people sowed in weeping that day, but they never looked for the harvest of joy, that when they saw Him, they could not believe that He had come back to receive something far greater than what they had lost. The one that they loved would never die again. The one that they loved conquered death, not for himself only, but for all who would trust in him. What Jesus sowed in tears. And don't forget, Jesus cried too over those events. Hebrews tells us what? He cried and pleaded on that night in the garden when he sweat those tears, when he sweat those drops of blood. And those people cried and wept for him as he was on the road, and they cried and wept at the foot of the cross. So great was that harvest, sown in sorrow with weeping, and now the joy that comes from it. Don't lose your joy. Don't lose your harvest because you failed to sow it as this year closes out.